Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. And good morning to you all, and good morning to my co-host Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Hey there, Nick.
Nice to see you this morning.
Good to be here again.
And we have a special guest this morning.
We do.
Back with us again, Ross Hill, a regular visitor from Melbourne, up here again for some business. We might even talk a bit about that later in the day.
Yeah.
So what we're doing with all of that. Welcome, Ross. Nice to see you again. What are we on to today? We're going to be chatting about starting with a little bit of the local situation. There is an election coming up on Saturday.
There is, yeah. So we'll have a look at some local and global current affairs from the perspective of collapse and emergence. And there's a general theme of leadership and organisational structuring around new leadership. And I think running through a number of threads today.
Yes, well, just on that, we'll maybe extend it briefly. Some people might have seen Bill Shorten on Q&A on the ABC a week or so ago, and I watched that. I was actually very impressed with him for the first time, and I thought, there's some potential for a bit of new leadership with this chap. I mean, I could be naive, I could be idealistic, but there you go. But I did sort of read something into his in his persona that made me feel intuitively that there was something quite real about this man. And, it surprised me actually, because I'd always thought he was a bit dull and boring. And just another part of the establishment, which of course is also
his game, which is great. And it's encouraging to see that. And we've also got to factor in that we're really dealing with a broken political system, as are most countries around the world at the moment. These are systems that were designed before the internet and designed with different motivations. You know, when different values were common across society. Society's changed, values have changed, and these systems are failing, unfortunately. And it's wonderful to get a positive, constructive leader, but we still also have to deal with the fact that there's large-scale corporate capture of political systems right across the planet. And of course, we've got the precedent here in Australia of Kevin Rudd, who came in, seemingly with a refreshing approach and some new ideas, and was very quickly shut down, largely due to money thrown at a campaign to get him out of power by the mining lobby here in Australia. So, and of course, going back in history to the last huge wave of change that came through in the 1960s, there's the story of JFK, which we can't forget either.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans. And Ross Hill is also with us this week, our special guest, who's been a regular visitor when he's up here from Melbourne. And thanks to B for dropping in and launching the countdown for the tribute to Countdown, June the 8th at the Bangalow Bolo. See you there. Election this week, Steve, Ross. It's a big one, obviously, for everybody. Hard to make sense of many of the movements and the fake news, if you will, the propaganda, the angles, the stories, the controversies that sort of riven through that's not the right word, through our political discourse, but there it is, threaded through our political discourse.
Threaded, yeah, that's a good word, yeah. Very true, and one good indicator is always to look at where the money is going, and if you look at the gambling around this election, then it's certainly favouring a Labor Party victory. That's for sure. And as you said, Bill Shorten's sounding refreshing and putting forward some new ideas, and I'm sure that's his honest intention. The big question is, if he is elected as the next Prime Minister, will he be able to implement those things, and will there be too many obstacles in the way of sort of some of the more radical changes that they're proposing? That is the big question. And as I just pointed out during the break, I've just pulled up an article from 2017.
Yes, which is a long time ago, but very relevant, because where is this gone? It's disappeared.
Exactly, yeah. So this article is, the headline is Cambridge Analytica the Liberal Party's 2019 trump card? That's in relation to the Australian election. That's happening next weekend. And of course, everybody listening probably knows that Cambridge Analytica was intimately involved in the social media campaign during the last American election.
And Brexit also.
And also Brexit as well. And not long after, I think it was probably around the time this article was, just shortly before this article was written, there was the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, visited Australia to talk to our politicians out here. So what's really interesting, though, I think, is that I haven't seen any recent media about the possibility of Cambridge Analytica or that style of marketing being involved in the current election, and that's probably a little concerning that it's gone quiet. Actually, it makes me wonder what's happening behind the scenes.
I remember this being reported at some point, I think later than that, it might have been last year, sometime 2018, when the whole Cambridge Analytica sort of thing burst through. And at that point, there was some indication that this had happened, that Cambridge Analytica representatives had been here in 2017. But I looked it up then, and there was very, very little reporting on it anywhere then, let alone now.
Yeah.
So it was kept quiet right up front, I think. That's probably the likely scenario.
Yeah, and the difficulty now is it's hard to know. It's hard to know what's being done in terms of targeting social media.
Yeah. And on that note, you can look on the flip side. We sort of see that Cambridge Analytica, the company, may have gone away and gone quiet, but the social networks are still the social networks, and so Facebook is Facebook, Twitter is Twitter. Seemingly every few weeks they apologize for another thing that's gone wrong and more data leaking out of their platforms, or unintended consequences, or trolling and abuse, and there's heaps of stuff going on, and that all sounds very familiar. So I'd suggest that hasn't changed over the last few years, and there is obviously a bit of a broadening. A few years ago, we maybe in Australia just talked about Facebook and Twitter and some of these more Western ones. This year, there's been a bit of a focus on WeChat,
yes,
Chinese
WeChat
platform,
yes,
as the leaders have joined that, and that's quite interesting because WeChat is from China, not from the United States, and so it has a different regulatory environment and different, everything tied up in a national system, and so it will have types of censorship which are different to the censorship you might expect from Facebook. Different controls, different things that you're allowed to say. It's pretty widely known that there's a lot of events or topics that you don't mention when you're in China, and so you don't mention them on the social media as well. Just as when you talk about certain topics on Facebook, you're going to get moderated away. And so all of that is still there, and that obviously has an effect on the election as well.
Yeah.
How do we know who to trust?
Yeah, exactly. And there was an article in the ABC just recently about Chinese media mocking the current Prime Minister in WeChat posts, which you've got to wonder where that's been coming from also. But in terms of the general paradigm shift that's going on globally, that is favouring a shift towards community thinking. And, clearly with the Labor Party having a socialist foundation, it generally favours, that's where people's thinking is looking. People are looking towards the wisdom of crowds, looking towards rebalancing this society, which is so much out of balance in terms of the distribution of wealth and privilege. And the Liberal Party, of course, is well regarded as representing that 1%. So it gives them a general disadvantage in terms of the current thinking.
Yeah, and of course, what it all boils down to is you go into the polling booth on the day. I actually pre-voted a few days ago, since I do a lot of travel. You get your bit of paper and you write down a few numbers on a page, right? You put it in the box and you hope for the best.
That's right, exactly.
That's the end of your engagement with the democratic process. So we're just suggesting that's bad for a lot of people.
Soak up some media. We learn what we can.
Yeah.
Some of it we go and find and research ourselves, and some of it we just listen to what we normally listen to, which is great. But from my experience, it's like, you write your numbers on the paper. It's you could say it's more difficult to engage. If you want to run for office or something, that is what it is. But at the same time, you can vote with a tweet. You can vote with every dollar that you spend in a shop. And so we have a lot of different ways of expressing, our influence. And that sort of relates to advertising. If you look at Cambridge Analytica, it's advertising. And it's just saying, how do we get these messages out to the people? And do they listen to them and respond? And so to me, that feels very similar to every time you hear an ad about something or you see a mention, and does it change how you live your life, and does it change how you spend your money? It does.
Yeah. And there are layers and layers of problems within the system the issue of corporate capture is one that we talk about a lot here, and that reflects the mindset of the modern scientific industrial paradigm, in that it will change the world to suit itself. It's very much driven by personal success, which often means financial success. And so over the years, the electoral boundaries have been changed, to make it more likely for the government of the time to get back into power. And then
gerrymandering, certainly that's the case in America, and I think in Queensland. I think this time, though, there's been a redistribution of electoral boundaries which favours Labor, interestingly. Which is independent.
Federally, you say?
Federally, yeah. Yeah, there is. I think there's like 3 seats that are nominally now regarded as likely Labor rather than likely Liberal in the selection. Right. So that's just a change in demographics within different regions. Yeah.
It is interesting. And then, essentially we're dealing with a binary system where, even though we have a number of political parties, at the end of the day there are 2 main parties, and it's usually an either or kind of a decision here. Although Australia does have a reasonable history of using our Senate as a bit of a pressure release mechanism, and
keeping the bastards honest.
Exactly, voting in minor parties to allow the Senate to veto any radically unfavourable legislation that might be, pushed through by the government at the time.
Or of course, manipulate special interests, very small special interests, in order to get some of that legislation through. And that's a danger, I suppose, of the minor party structured Senate. But I think it's a good thing that we have that independence, because it shows the diversity and sort of equalisation of the field in some sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, and again, with the paradigm shift, we're seeing a general fragmentation of everything. Things are being broken down, and we are looking to this wisdom of crowds idea. You could also look at it as a kind of a big data approach, where you take in as much information as you can in order to make a decision, rather than allowing just a couple of people who are privileged to make the decisions for everybody.
You do, which is often overwhelming.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. The big data.
Unroll that big Senate voting paper.
Absolutely, it is, and that's the challenge that the emerging paradigm faces, is that overwhelming amount of data, and everybody wants to have a say. Everybody should have a say, according to the worldview, and you get flooded with information.
So that's a really important point. We refer to this notion quite often here, the idea of overwhelm and confusion, given the complexity of things and the amount of information that's available to any one individual who's plugged in anywhere in the world now. How do you resolve that? How do you move beyond? I know, big question. Just simply for today, how do you move move beyond that flood of stuff that comes towards us, and make some sort of sense of it, so you can actually live a engaged life, and hopefully contribute to a better world, etc.
Embrace the flood.
Maybe just that. Yeah, good answer. I like that.
I mean, the flood is overwhelming, but it's better than a little trickle of water, right? I mean, if you look back, you maybe watch a few TV shows, or just the news, which was a singular thing, and now there's lots of newses you can look at, and you can listen to your friends, and you can listen to the groups you're a part of.
Is that a word? Newses? The past tense of news? Newses. Kind of like that.
The flood of newses.
One of the mechanisms that's built into this paradigm shift to deal with that is relocalization. And so, instead of trying to take in all of the information from the whole world, you come back to your local and immediate needs and interests, and rebuilding local community. And at that scale, that all-inclusive process is manageable. And so that's one of the ways that in the short term this is going to work very, very well. And the refocus to local everything is going to make that process of inclusivity manageable initially. Eventually, we know from all of the information that we have, from all the research that's been done around this, that this emerging paradigm is going to be the shortest lived paradigm of them all so far, maybe only just a couple of decades. And the reason that it's going to be short-lived is because of this issue of trying to include all of the information, trying to include everybody. Eventually it is going to get overwhelming, and we're going to do the big pop and leap to second-tier consciousness, driven by that tension.
Yeah, it can be hard to let go, though. We do.
Oh, totally, absolutely.
It is very satisfying.
It won't be an easy process. We know that.
And correct me, of course, if I'm not accurate here, but that leap into what we call second-tier consciousness, what was called that by Claire W. Graves. We weren't going to mention Claire's name today, but there we did.
You had to put a jelly bean in the jar.
Put a jelly bean in the jug. I love jelly beans. The notion that moving to second tier, from that so much going on, overwhelm, confusion, how do I make sense of everything, to all of a sudden leaping into a place where, this is my role. and this is my role in this network here that I've established, and this is what I'm to do now. That sort of clearing away the macheting through the forest of your own confusion to find the path that is true for you.
Yeah,
that seems to be what's going on, what needs to happen in order to move to a second.
Absolutely, level. But I wouldn't say that's limited to second tier. I mean, you can do that, finding your own path and finding your place in the world in any of the layers of consciousness. It's not just a second tier thing. I think the thing that really makes the difference when we do transition to second tier is we get access to new information that we don't have access to previously, and in that we start to be able to interpret consciousness, and I guess see people more deeply than we've ever seen them before, and that opens up far more sense-making tools that solve a lot of the complexity that we have at the moment. Like if you just think about the fake news issue as an example at the moment, all of this information coming at us through social media, how do we know what to listen to and what not to listen to? And from a second-tier perspective, a way to cut through that noise is actually to use the capacity to analyze level of consciousness and you can do it through the analysis of written language or spoken word. Then you can actually identify the more complex and capable sources of information and simply pay attention to those. So that's a way of sorting through this diversity that's very, very efficient and effective, but that's not available until the transition into second tier.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking Future Sense here on Bay FM. Yes, that's the opening minute or so of Dirty Power from Greenpeace. Powerful little piece. It's only 15 minutes long, and we certainly suggest, folks, that you have a look at that if you're interested in. It's pretty obvious. It certainly makes a big difference. It certainly makes a big difference to how I even looked at the serious complexity of the coal and other mining interests in this country.
Yeah, and it goes to show how deep it runs as well. Like it's thoroughly captured the whole system, the political system, in other words, by these big money interests. And in Australia, that just happens to be the coal or the fossil fuel lobby, the mining lobby in general, not just fossil fuels.
And we talked about at breakfast here the fact that this 15-minute video talks about the coalition members, and it details. It's a very fine piece of journalism. Details the connections between many members of the coalition, the current coalition government, and past coalition governments, the mining industry, particularly the coal industry, and the lobby groups associated with, and the sort of revolving doors between all those three back and forth. Doesn't mention one Labor Party operative or member in this particular video.
No, it's clearly biased in that respect.
We should
be clear about that. Even so, it's a valid observation of what is. From that particular perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, we should remember that there was a lot of money from the mining industry that got poured into media to promote or perhaps trigger the removal of Kevin Rudd as the Prime Minister. And then that was really the trigger of this cascade of, revolving Prime Ministers that we've had since then, short term.
5 Prime Ministers since 2007.
I know. Yeah. So we
we're
shouldn't
like Italy.
That.
We're worse than Italy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Italians.
Of course, Kevin Rudd also was Kevin 07, and he was really the first Australian
to use his name to rhyme as a slogan.
Not the first for that, but he
probably not.
He did use social media very heavily and made a big deal of it, which worked in his favour to a degree. But it is interesting that that those sort of networks are growing and continuing to grow, and so. Obviously all the current candidates are on social media, so it's not a big deal anymore. But it's interesting to look at how big are these networks, and at what stage do they overtake some of the previous most powerful networks. So lobbying is sort of taken for granted. Kevin was probably hopeful that his social media following would overpower that, but it undid him in the end. And so at what stage does that new form of network start to bring more power with it?
Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other interesting connection with Kevin, of course, was his connection to China.
Yeah.
And he's a Chinese speaker and Mandarin speaker, of course.
Yes. He would have been on WeChat.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think back to Whitlam's removal in 1975, and there was actually a movie made about the alleged CIA involvement of the removal of Whitlam, who of course was a socialist.
Oh yes, comrade.
And so you've got to factor those influences in as well. I mean, the relationship between Australia and the USA is a long one and a very powerful one, and any significant move towards a threat to that relationship would be drawing the attention of all of those who are involved in.
And it's very interesting because I mentioned a Netflix show that I've just watched a little bit of in the last few days called Pine Gap, an Australian, I think it's an Australian-American production, it's essentially Australian though, which looks at exactly that, of this relationship between America, Australia and China, and how Australia's sort of in the centre of that right now in all sorts of ways. Biggest trading partner on one hand, and yet our major military and cultural alliances with the United States, and there's a growing schism potentially in that relationship. And the Pine Gap's worth having a look at, folks, on Netflix. I don't know how it ends up, but it's actually surprisingly quite decent. I thought it was probably a bit of trash, but actually it's quite good.
That's interesting.
Of course, the place itself has a big fence around it, so it's hard to physically go and look at it. But it is an American-Australian production.
Exactly. Well, I do remember someone told me back in the 80s when Bob Hawke was elected Prime Minister, this is an anecdote that I was told I always remember, where he was taken to Pine Gap and he was taken down underneath into the very secretive parts as the new Australian Prime Minister. And when he came out, Bob Hawke, as we know, feisty, the way that he was, the way that he was, he came out sort of ashen-faced, and the interpretation was he'd been shown and told things that was that. You are now the Prime Minister of this minor country, and we, the Americans, are in control here, and this is what we're doing, and thanks very much, you can toe the line.
One of my contacts, who I'll leave nameless at this stage, who was very, very senior defence officer here in Australia, said to me once that he'd just been on a tour of the NSA in the US, and he shook his head and he said, "If you saw what I saw there, you'd never touch a computer again."
There you go. Oh my God. You're tuned to Future Sense here with myself, Nick Jeans, Steve McDonald, and our guest, Ross Hill. You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up. You're tuned to Future Sense 99.9 here with myself, Nick Jeans, Steve McDonald, and our special guest, Ross Hill. You can text in, and thanks for a couple of texts here, on 043734 1119, 043734 1119. And we've just been raving a little bit, roaming across the field of Australian politics. But we're going to go a little bit wider now here. Yeah, Steve.
Yeah, just a few current affairs issues from around the world on the topic of emergence. Elon Musk is about to launch some satellites, Ross.
He is. So most people are probably aware that he's been working on launching rockets and satellites into orbit. And the cool trick is that they can land the rockets and reuse them again, which is obviously more sustainable, because you're not throwing the rockets out, which was the previous model. But it also means it's a lot cheaper to launch the rockets, because you just have to fill up the tank and give it a polish, and up it goes again. And so what they've been quietly working on in the background for the last 4 or so years is a satellite internet company. And so they've traditionally launched their own rockets, but with other people's satellites. And so what they're doing now is preparing to launch their own satellites to give us a international broadband network. And so the real shift is that if you look at satellite internet at the moment, such as the NBN has 2 satellites. They're huge 6 and a bit ton, monoliths, and they have to hover over the same place of the Earth as the Earth spins around.
Yeah.
So that means they're hanging out at around 35,000 kilometers away. And every time you load a picture on Instagram, it has to go 35,000 kilometers and back. And that's why it's traditionally quite slow. So the big shift here is that they want to launch these satellites at an altitude of about 350 kilometers high. Some of them 1,000 kilometers, which is a lot different to 30,000 kilometers. Yeah. And so what that means is they're really, really fast, and a comparable speed.
And they're tiny, aren't they? The satellites themselves are pretty small, aren't they?
Yeah. So because they're closer to the Earth, they don't last as long, because they're going to eventually burn up in a couple of years' time. And so the real trick here is that they launch heaps of them. So this launch this week should have about 60 satellites, not one, but 60. And you throw them out, and they spin around the Earth in this low orbit for a couple of years, giving us internet access, and then they burn up naturally. And so the plan is not just to launch 1 or 2 satellites like the NBN have done, but to launch within the next 6 to 9 years about 10,000 satellites. So this launch will be 60, but they will need to average 50 or 60 new satellites in orbit every month continuously.
Every month?
To keep it up there. So
that's a lot of space junk. Or do they burn up completely? What happens to the burnt out satellites? Do they burn up completely? No, there must be some refuse up there. Or do they completely...
No. The idea is they're designed purposefully to burn up in a planned fashion over time. In a couple of years once they're done, and so even if they break on launch, gravity will pull them down. They go away, and so that's why they depend on relaunching new ones, and it becomes this permanent thing. So if they pull it off, we'll have potentially super fast internet around the whole planet. And that would be really cool. They're not doing it alone. There's also Boeing and OneWeb, other companies who are working on similar things.
Yeah, an absolute game changer, really. Do you know how that technology is going to work? I mean, will devices be able to talk directly to the satellites? Will there be intermediate ground stations? Or?
Yeah, so they're still working on that at the moment.
Right.
But the general idea is that you have a box on your roof, just like the current satellite ones, but instead of having to point the dish somewhere and the issues that has with it, it'll be a lot smaller, something a little bit like a pizza box with probably a solar panel and an antenna.
Interesting.
And that would give you Wi-Fi into your house.
Yeah, sweet.
But the upside is, and the real opportunity is, that's all you need is this box. You can put a solar panel on it, and so you can be in the middle of nowhere with your little box and get really, really fast internet.
Yeah. And how are they monetizing this? I mean, how are they going to pay for it?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I assume they're going to charge us a lot of money.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
So it's fast internet for everybody who can afford it.
Yeah, and so they haven't really announced what they're going to do and what the plan is for monetizing it at the moment. But just as they're shifting the model on launching it, and it is a lot cheaper to launch these satellites than the traditional models. So I imagine they're, if it's too expensive, we're not going to buy it, right? So it's going to have a lot more reach than the traditional satellite internet, but it won't replace your mobile phone.
Yeah. It's interesting because we're living at a time now where some high schools are actually sending rockets into space, aren't they?
Yeah.
Which is pretty amazing in itself.
And other high schools are banning mobile phones in classroom at school. So you've got things happening on both sides.
I know. Isn't that interesting? In other news, the city of Denver has just voted via referendum to decriminalise magic mushrooms, which is very, very interesting. And as has been the case, Colorado seems to be leading the way in the rollout of psychedelic medicines. And I was talking recently to a venture capital fund manager who's interested in these sorts of progressive things, and he was predicting that Colorado the whole state will fully legalize magic mushrooms in the not too distant future, which is very, very interesting. And he sees them going down a very similar road to medical cannabis.
Yeah. On the topic of cannabis, a report a couple of days ago from the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA in America, not a particularly avid backer of the cultivation and legalization of marijuana. However, in a new Federal Register filing set to soon be published, the anti-drug agency is gearing up to increase the total amount of cannabis that can be legally grown in the US for research purposes. The increase is rumoured to be more than 5 times the amount of what is allowed at the current date, which is approximately 1,000 pounds, and will increase to roughly 5,400 pounds next year. Meanwhile, the DEA is also planning to lessen the amount of certain opioid drugs, such as oxycodone, hydrocodone, morphine, fentanyl, and others that are manufactured in the United States. So basically, they're waking up a little bit to the potential for cannabis to replace the use of opioids to some degree.
Very interesting. And, there's an awful lot of tension around this, I'm sure, much of it not getting into the media, but the large pharmaceutical companies are standing to lose a terrible amount of money from the sale of these opioid-based pharmaceuticals as medical cannabis comes onto the market, unless, of course, they reorient themselves to take advantage of the medical cannabis growth.
Well, the end of this article says that it's time that Congress looked at the 28,000 plus peer-reviewed studies currently hosted on the National Institute of Health's online database and reform federal law by removing marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act altogether. which would be certainly a good thing. That's the time has come for these medicines to start to really come online around the world, and that's an exciting change for the future for sure.
It is exciting. Yeah, another exciting change is that the crypto market looks like it's starting to move again.
It is. It's
Yeah.
showing signs of life.
Absolutely.
So in the past week, Bitcoin, the original cryptocurrency, peaked over 10,000 Australian dollars, and Ethereum, which is the second biggest one at the moment, is up around $280.
Yeah.
So it was a big spike because that's going up about 15 or 20% in a single day.
Yeah, if you look at the all-time Bitcoin price chart, then it's very, very clearly ticking up. I'm just holding it up for the other fellas to see here.
Definitely ticking up.
Have a look at that, folks. Look at that graph.
But it could go anywhere from here, right?
It could, but look at the trade volume on there, which
Yeah.
is really interesting. You know, the trade volume is
Down the bottom there.
actually on this graph that I'm looking at, which is current as of today, the 13th of May, it looks like there's been a spike in 24-hour volume that exceeds any previous level, according to this graph on coinmarketcap.com.
Yeah,
That's
and so that's
interesting.
quite interesting because the
Yeah.
price has been relatively stable for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, but the volume is definitely picking up. People
Yeah.
having another look at what's happening. And what's changed since the last big peak is there's tens of thousands of different projects and currencies and assets and tokens, and people are putting real estate into cryptocurrency tokens so you can trade it differently. People are representing fashion now. There's different couture outfits that are being sold around. Lots of different projects. Nike just put a patent out registering, I've forgotten the name right now, but it's something like, crypto shoes.
Crypto shoes.
So you can trade these different styles as well. So there's a lot of movement happening, but effectively, when cryptocurrency first came out, it was saying, here's Bitcoin. It's a bit like digital gold. And some people love gold and they got excited by that. But your everyday person is probably not as interested in gold. But now it's seeping into everything. So
Yeah.
whether it's shoes or real estate, it's representing these different forms of value in a digital form. And that means we can send it and we can trade it and we can value it in much different ways.
Is it, these applied uses that are expanding in all sorts of directions in our lives, how's that facing off against the difference in government regulations around the world? Because they're all in tax. All countries seem to be, the little that I know about it, they're not on the same page.
They're not. No. Just as with anything, there's different tax situations and legal situations in each country, and of course that makes it interesting when you're working with the internet because you can look at the internet from every country. So there's been a bit of movement in places like Malta. Malta treat cryptocurrency a little bit differently, in the same way that the Cayman Islands are associated with certain times of privacy. Malta is becoming a bit of a crypto hub. Singapore as well, and it's because they're sort of loosening some of the restrictions, or they just don't have the restrictions. So that is interesting, and companies will move around. So one of the top exchanges called Binance started in China, moved to Malta. Unfortunately, this week they lost $40 million of Bitcoin in a hack. So that also happened. The hacks haven't gone away. Keeps things interesting.
So because originally, and I think we've talked about this before a year or so ago, the notion of hacking these cryptocurrencies is not an easy thing to do, and yet it is possible. So it is a risk, isn't it? It does happen. It does happen.
Happens all the time.
Yeah.
And just like if you look at the history of banking, there was gold robbers, right? You used to literally rob the bank. You'd go in, you'd take the stuff, and you've got it. And cryptocurrency is quite similar. If you have the private key of the asset, then you can run off with it.
Just don't need a getaway car.
Well, but you leave bigger footprints, right? Everything's on the blockchain, and so it's not as automatic as just taking the stuff because you can follow where it's going. And so there are new systems coming up, different ways of protecting wallets, and making use of network effects. So there are some where if you do lose your key, you can go and recover it through a group system, or if you're on an exchange, the exchange will help you with that and charge you a fee for it. And so there are these new things evolving. It's not a finished perfect system, but it's very, very interesting, and I don't think many people would claim that it's going away. It's definitely not going away. We still buy stuff, we still pay for stuff, And we do want to do it more internationally and faster and cheaper and in new ways.
Yeah.
As we've been mentioning on recent episodes, there has been a lot of talk of a potential liquidity crisis, a global liquidity crisis this month, and I guess we're nearly halfway through the month now. Hasn't shown up yet, so whether it's going to happen or not, we don't know, but if it does, it'll be very interesting to see how that impacts the crypto market, which way it goes. Could go either way, I think.
Yeah, one of the other big differences in the current market and liquidity is that a couple of years ago you had to trade everything through Bitcoin. So you would spend your Aussie dollars on Bitcoin, then you would trade it for something else. And now there's so many more exchanges popping up around the world, and they're much more flexible. So you can buy the actual thing you want to buy much more directly. And very so true. That does change the system.
It does, for sure, yeah. In other news, I guess this is more in the collapse file than the emergence file, a bit of climate news. There's an article here from about a week ago talking about farmers in the Midwest of the USA who've been waiting a very long time for floodwaters to recede. And of course, there was some extraordinary cold weather during the American winter this year, the North American winter, which dropped an awful lot of snow. And all of that has melted and is running down the rivers. And right at the moment, according to this article, which I said is about a week old, the Mississippi River has been at major flood stage for 41 days in a row, and there's more rain coming as well. And they're warning that the major flooding may extend into June, and that means that many farmers will not be able to plant crops at all this year. So we're looking at fewer crops and less food, of course, which usually means rising food prices. And in the longer term forecast, particularly from Armstrong Economics, this is going to be an increasingly significant issue. And I think his computer algorithm has been talking about 2024 as a significant year for crop losses impacting food prices and general food shortages. And as we controversially do mention on the show sometimes, that there is some scientific evidence that's pointing to the emergence of a mini ice age instead of actually global warming, which we understand is very controversial. So we're generally quite mindful about how we talk about it. But if that is true, then that will mean major crop losses. And in the work of mathematician and astrophysicist Dr. Valentina Zarkova, which has involved study of solar dynamics and solar weather and how it impacts the planet, she has said that from 2028 through 2032, then the entire world will be facing serious crop losses from climate-related issues, particularly cold weather, and all of the consequences, like this example from Mississippi, where all of that cold weather produces snow and ice, which melts and then floods, and then farmers can't plant their crops. And Valentina Zarkova has said very, very specifically that according to her research, this is going to be so significant that unless governments plan in advance, there are going to be major problems with people not being able to get access to food.
Yeah, this is one of the things too that's also being tracked from orbit, where we've always had these, well, not always, but there's a lot of people taking photos of the planet.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more different databases of imagery that are becoming available, some that are updated as much as twice a day. And so one interesting capability that gives is you can go back in time through pictures of the planet, and you can see the shift. Like, there was a forest here this week, it's not there next week. These crops are looking good, these crops are looking bad. Here's the state of this flood over there. And of course, that's a lot of stuff, and it's quite overwhelming. So there's a bunch of different organizations. There's a new one as well called What Time, and they're looking at using AI to crunch all of this imagery. And I think optimistically, they're claiming they might be able to track the carbon emissions of coal power plants. I think that's a bit of a stretch perhaps at the moment.
Yeah.
You can track smoke, visible smoke, quite easily. And what we're going to see over time is just you'll be able to track more and more stuff. Some of these companies are claiming they can count how many trees are on the planet. And so some of those stats are very, very powerful. Some others, like carbon dioxide molecules, I'm not sure.
That's interesting. I mean,
generally more.
What Time is a non-profit artificial intelligence firm, and it claims whatever the quality and the depth of knowledge that they are able to ascertain from this satellite imagery crunched in this way, they are saying that it will be not just available to regulators and politicians, but the public as well. So that's a good thing. Yeah, interesting. Why do you think it's going to be difficult to really articulate good numbers of what is being emitted from a coal-fired power station, for example.
So
don't they do that already? I thought that's how they measured things. No, obviously not.
How do they measure these things? I'm not a scientist. But when you're starting with imagery, there's a lot of stuff once you look at satellite maps a little bit, there's a lot of stuff that's very visible that you don't think about when you're on the ground. So if you've got a coal mine, an open cut coal mine next to a coal plant, you can see how much coal is being dug out. That's going through the system. Emissions are coming out of that. Hedge funds have done the same thing for a long time with those big oil tanks. And from the ground, they look like this big round oil tank. From the top, they have this floating roof in a lot of them. And you can see by the shadow of the sun on the side of the tank how full the oil tank is.
Oh, interesting.
So there's all sorts of stuff that you get a different perspective on the world literally from being above. You can spot a lot of stuff.
The overview effect.
Yeah, and that in combination with this big cloud computing and AI type systems of machine learning, they can crunch a lot more numbers than we can ourselves rationally. And so that's super cool. We've got a bigger calculator, but we still need direction on, double checking. Like, does this really make sense? Can we really measure that stuff?
That's right. And what sort of modelling systems are these figures that we're collecting being fed into?
Yes,
as well.
Yes,
has a big impact on it. And in other news, the UN chief has come out and warned of total disaster, quote unquote, if global warming is not stopped. And according to this report from the Globe and Mail, he's saying that the world must dramatically change the way it fuels factories, vehicles and homes to limit future warming to a level scientists nearly call impossible, actually. And, there's a perfect storm brewing here. If you take that angle, the global warming angle, and the calls to in some respects, shut down industrialized civilization versus the possibility that we don't actually have all the science sorted out, and as we've said before on the show, a lot of the global warming movement seems to blindly repeat mantras rather than actually looking at the evidence. And the emerging paradigm at the moment, this relativistic, network-centric, humanistic way of being human that's emerging, has a tendency to collapse hierarchies. And in doing so, often it can lose cause and effect relationships, lose sight of them completely.
And also get fixated on simple numbers.
Yeah, that's right. And
one number to rule them all.
Yeah, and what I think is really important at this stage in our history is to keep an open mind and look at all the evidence, and not discard evidence because it's wrong, and there's a general opinion out there at the moment that it's wrong if you don't support global.
Are you with us or against
the global warming crowd? And I would argue what's actually wrong is to be closed-minded, and we should be open to all of the scientific evidence that is coming in. Keep monitoring it all, not just one hypothesis. Otherwise, we're going to get caught out seriously. And I think what's happening in Mississippi right now is a wonderful small-scale example of what could turn into a global disaster if we focus on this idea that it's going to get hotter, and we end up with a world that's got a whole mix of both hot and cold temperatures and some extremes in both directions. Then we won't be prepared for that.
And I think it's interesting too, as you said earlier today, you can really read a lot, of course, into language, and the language that's been used around this issue has been the term global warming for a long time predominantly. That's shifted a lot in my perception to the term climate change, and now to me the phrase climate instability seems to be rising, and that seems to be a much more accurate and sophisticated interpretation of what's going on. It is unstable for all sorts of reasons, yes, but we do not yet know perhaps exactly which direction it's going to, and that's a contentious thing to say, and it shouldn't be, because we do need to be more intelligent about the way that we approach the data out there.
Yeah, remaining curious is the key. And in the crazy ideas basket, there's a couple of interesting stories here. One's very recent, from the 10th of May, and it's an idea by a chap called Sir David King, which suggests that he must be from the UK probably. Here we go. He's a University of Cambridge professor, and he's come up with a radical new centre for climate repair, to repair the damage humans are doing to the environment. And one of the proposals he's floated is the idea of working to refreeze the polar regions. And I think his idea is something to do with generating cloud cover that would cool the poles down and allow them to refreeze. And it made me just look back in history a little bit to the 1970s, and I found an article back there, where some scientists were considering pouring soot over the Arctic in the 1970s to help melt the ice in order to prevent another ice age.
Yes, this is 1975 in Newsweek. It's quite an extensive piece on this, and I vaguely remember this era where there was talk of an ice age back then at some point. I kind of vaguely, at my age, could remember that a little bit too.
It certainly was on the cover of Time magazine and other big magazines for sure. It was the general feeling back then, and when people were coming up with some crazy ideas back then about how to change the Earth's climate also.
It's a very human thing too, I think, to say the climate's changing, let's change the climate.
Yeah.
Of course, we can change ourselves as well, right?
Absolutely.
One of the concerns, not look outwards too much.
One of the concerns now, though, is that back in the 1975s, in the 1970s, there were these crazy ideas, but we didn't necessarily have the technology, the capacity to carry them out. But now, with the technology and the understandings that we have, it's a bit scary because somebody is just got to throw enough money at one of these crazy ideas, and we may have some large scale
geoengineering,
uninformed geoengineering that happens, which could actually make things worse.
Yeah. And some people claim there's been geoengineering since the Second World War, though.
I'm sure there has. So there's no doubt that there has been, at certain scales. I mean, how widespread it is I guess anybody's guess. But even here in Tasmania, we have climate engineering going on, whereby they seed clouds down there to fill up dams and that kind of thing.
And famously, throughout Indonesia each year, there's a period of just burning down forests.
Oh, yes.
Often for planting palm oil and these
That's
things.
right.
But if you travel to somewhere else like Singapore during that time, it's really, really smoky. And so we're starting to see the flow and effects of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's right.
You're resonating right now on Future Sense with Steve McDonald and Nick Jeans. Oh yes, it's 10:16 here on Bay FM on Future Sense, and you can check all of our podcasts, our edited podcasts, via the website futuresense.it, and that's usually available within 24, maybe 48 hours at the most after the show each week. You can go there and see past shows of this edited out, all the sponsorships and also the music, unfortunately, because sometimes the music's good, but the content is right there, so check it out, futuresense.it. Yes, so Steve, we're going to talk a little bit about leadership in the last bit, because you guys have got to rush off soon, I know, because you've got an appointment. We'll come to that.
We do, yeah. Ross and I are scooting up to Queensland to run a strategic planning workshop for an organisation who is one of the major donors to our charitable foundation, which has been created to support this global paradigm shift and the emergence of human consciousness. And what some of the things we'll be talking to them about are how organisational structures are changing and how leadership is changing within the workplace. And I guess some of the central themes here are the collapse of hierarchies. So moving away from this, highly structured system that we've had during the modern scientific industrial era, where
top-down system.
It's top-down directed, and in the process of collapsing that, tapping into the wisdom of the crowd, and that also changes the leadership dynamic within an organisation, and it asks people to step up and exercise personal leadership, and so for everybody to become more involved in the decision-making process.
Does that first, when you say that, I immediately think about an individual's personal evolution, their regard, their awareness of, their conscious application to evolving, so to speak, developing themselves. Is that necessary for that? I guess it's tangled up together, but it would seem sometimes it's a very personal thing to actually make that movement towards more awareness and more consciousness about the planet, about what's going on.
It is, and it works both ways. So as an individual is learning more and trying new tricks and changing the way they live and the way they work, so is the organisation they're a part of, or organisations. And then as the organisation changes, maybe they get a new tool or they purchase a new company or something different happens at work, it demands more of the individual as well. So there is this pendulum from what is the individual doing and how are they impacting the organisation, and then at the same time, how is the organisation changing and impacting the person. So we've seen a lot of this through technology in the last couple of decades, where there was a time when no organisation had a telephone, and telephones came out, and we could organise things across towns really quick.
Well, it was so funny watching The Sting with Paul Newman and Robert Redford yesterday from 1973, and most people would be familiar with that, and the old dial telephones, and how slow it was to communicate, and how easy it made things to be crooked and to be distorted and to deceive people, because people didn't know what was going on half the time.
That's right, and of course that slowness of communication was central to the sting itself, and the sting being a setup where they were conning this guy out of his money, and they were relying on the fact that when a horse race was run, the results of the horse race would have to be typed into a telex machine and then would come out on a stream of of paper, which they called the wire. It would come down the wire and then be read out by the local announcer at the betting agency or wherever they were. And of course, what they had was a back-end communication channel where they would hear directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak, who won the race, and before it came through on the wire, they would know who to bet on. Yeah.
It was great, but amazingly of its time. When you think that that's only 45 years ago, it's not that long, but it is also a long time ago. But how much has changed in 45 years? My goodness,
exactly.
So now it's mobile phones. Then we brought the mobile phones to work.
It's right out there.
We have social networks. Bring the social networks to work. We have chat rooms everywhere at work. And it just keeps on moving, obviously. And each time it's increasing the possibility of how quickly we can speak within the organization and outside the organization with our customers and suppliers and everyone else. And so each time we're constantly challenged of, well, what do we do with the speed? And is speed necessarily better? And how do we cope with all of this extra information that's coming from inside the organization and outside the organization?
That networking, though, it certainly enables partly the breakdown of the hierarchy. So it doesn't just the fact that everybody knows much more about what's going on everywhere. So to speak.
It does. When I was in the military, I had sort of early access to these kind of practices, and I'm thinking now it must have been back in the late 1980s. So in some of the jobs that I had, I used to work with members of the SAS regiment, Special Air Service Regiment, who had very well resourced and often on the leading edge of whatever's new, and whatever's most effective in terms of procedures. And they were practicing in their small group patrols, and we're talking, it could be, say, a group of just 5 people, this collapsing of hierarchy process. And so within the group of 5, you might have one officer and some NCOs and some soldiers, and each of them would have a particular specialist skill. So one of them might have special skills in being a medic, one of them might be a signaller, etc. And so often on the job, they would actually collapse the hierarchy. So instead of the most senior person in the patrol making a decision, the decision would defer to whoever had the most expertise in that particular area. And so at the time, I thought that was very, very interesting. And now in hindsight, I can see it was the early emergence of this next paradigm of how organizations function, is this idea of collapsing hierarchy, deferring to expertise instead. But that also demands that the person with the expertise is prepared to step up, and take on that leadership responsibility and share their expertise with the team.
Very paradoxical at this time, isn't it, that this whole idea of levelling the field, everybody gets a voice, let's all sit in a circle, everybody gets an equal time to say what they feel about something, but that often, of course, doesn't get much done.
Exactly.
Too much talk. And so at some point, as you're saying, the person with the expertise in the moment over the issue at hand needs to be able to step up and say, well, I'm sort of going to lead this particular project right now. It doesn't mean I'm the leader in a hierarchical sense. It's just this is the most appropriate moment.
There are lots and lots of complicators that can get in the way of this working effectively. One of them being, as you said, over communication and under action. And it really demands the dropping away of competitive dynamics within the group. While you've got those power-based dynamics happening, it really undercuts the effectiveness of this kind of process. So that's a big part of making it work.
Yeah, and as people are bringing this new network technology into the workplace, it is very tempting. People spend a lot of time on some of these chat tools, and they're just chatting a lot. And while we can look at them as a way to reduce the friction involved with communicating with each other, it actually demands that we reinforce some of the hierarchy around decision making and action. So we can sit around chatting about a new issue all day and getting everyone up to speed, but we can't do that about everything the organization does. So traditionally, that's where you have the hierarchy, and the boss or the CEO or whoever it is the tiebreaker. They used to be the tiebreaker for the action decision as well as the communication. Because of the way communication worked. So it would flow through a centralized hub of the leader or the department head or the CEO, and then back down the other side. Once we flatten the communication, we still need people to push along that action. And so there is this kind of decoupling of the communication, which could be separate from some of the decision making. And so while we're empowering the people maybe at the edges of the network who might have the best skills or be the most well informed on particular things, and the executives can do a lot to empower those people and let them step up. It does definitely work both ways.
It does, yeah. There's a book which came out in 2014 by Frederick Laloux called Reinventing Organisations, which looks at the emergence of these new ways of organising and communicating and managing within companies, etc. And it's a very, very good book. He's used some of the spiral dynamics stuff, which is based on Claire Graves, and also Ken Wilber's integral theory in putting forward that. And he talks about teal organisations, which are not exactly second tier, but they're very, very close to it. So we're talking about high functioning layer 6, which is the emerging paradigm. Very high functioning is what he's describing, and he's giving a couple of examples in the book of existing organisations that are making this process work. And generally they tend to be organisations that already have fairly well established workflow processes, and so people are part of an active process that's connected to other parts of the organisation, and so that tends to compensate for any tendency for people to sort of just talk too much and not do enough work, because they have to fit in with the workflow process, and they know that some other group is relying on them to have an output within a certain amount of time. And I think that's fairly essential. You've got to have that kind of structure. I think the potential downfall of trying out this new way of working is to think that it doesn't need any structure or leadership at all. And I've seen things go wrong, particularly in community organisations, where people make the assumption that, let's collapse the hierarchy, but we don't need a leader. But we actually do need people to step up and show leadership where their expertise applies. And we also need to have a structure so that we know there's going to be an output, and not just a big discussion.
Yeah. A lot of the time, once you collapse some of these hierarchies, you almost revert to schoolyard bullying. It's the person with the loudest voice, not necessarily the best voice.
Exactly. And as is the case with all of the first tier layers of consciousness, is when people are operating out of one of these layers, they often kind of make the assumption that everybody else is too. And I think there's certainly an element of that in some of the literature around this new way of working. Is there's an assumption that everybody's going to be espousing the same values at work, and then that's simply not the case. and we do know that often some of the consciousness layers which have a tendency to have power over or manipulate others, they have a field day in these sort of free-flowing structures where there aren't too many boundaries and stuff, because it's just like open season for them. So that could be
it's interesting. I mean, from the book you're talking about, Reinventing Organisations by Frederick Laloux. One of the quotes, which applies to what you're just saying here, I think, the most exciting breakthroughs of the 21st century, he says, will not occur because of technology, but because of an expanding concept of what it means to be human. And that's really the key, isn't it? That's really the change in people that's going to actually facilitate the deeper change in organisations.
Yeah, I mean, we're tapping into this emerging new way of being human, which is more capable, and it's more capable essentially because of the use of network dynamics and the sharing of information and action. Yeah.
Awesome. You guys are going to have to run off shortly, aren't
you?
We
are going to have to hit the road.
But you've got a couple of things to finish off with, I can tell.
Very soon. Yeah. I was just going to, before we finish on this topic, I was just going to mention the book The Wisdom of Crowds, which was published in 2004 by James Surowiecki. And he gave 3 things which are essential for the wisdom of crowds to work. And the first one was independence of decision. And that's really important, because if you've got people going along with everyone else's decision rather than exercising their own decision-making process, then that undercuts the wisdom, because you basically end up with a kind of a cult rather than a diversity of input. The second thing that he raised was that diversity of information, and once again, if you've got something like, and I'll use the example of global warming, where it's become like, if you don't go along with the global warming thing, then you're just out. We're not even going to listen to you. And in fact, you should be censored. And what that does is it undercuts this idea of diversity of information, and it means that you are not getting access to information which could be and probably is useful and important to your process. And so it's really important to preserve that, and that's why I'm always saying, stay curious. Let's be open to everything. Let's account for and assess everything rather than excluding stuff. And the third thing that he mentioned that was critical to the wisdom of crowds is the decentralization of organisation, which is exactly what we're talking about here. This collapsing of the hierarchical structure, but the the remaining importance of leadership and also discipline within the group as well, and fairness and balance.
And it really is the action that brings us back to that focus. We can chat, but there's a deadline, or there's a meeting, or something's happening. We've got to open the shop. And it's very easy to get stuck in these loops of romanticizing. We've got a network, we can include everyone. Oh, hang on, did we do that thing? It's overdue.
Exactly. And that, if there's one single common flaw that I see in organizations, whether they be community committees or money profit-making organizations who try this stuff, then that's the most common flaw, is that there's too much communication, not enough action.
And are we overlooking the obvious stuff?
As
my friend Simon Terry likes to say about his future of work, one of the biggest differences, as quoted by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, is that people entering the workforce are on average 8 centimetres taller than those retiring. So larger doorways for everyone.
Must be all the growth
That's
hormones
really
in the
funny.
chicken.
That's really good. That's a good note to leave, I think.
Yeah, we had a cut and run.
Yeah, you guys cut and run. I'll play some
great.
music and say a few other things here in the next half hour. Maybe I'll just shut up and play music, whatever. Thanks to Steve McDonald, my regular co-host, who'll be back next week, of course, and to our guest, Ross Hill, who no doubt will be back again in the future. Thanks, guys. You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.